The city was not conquered, it was consumed. Between 1942 and 1943, Stalingrad became less a battlefield than a graveyard of nations, where strategy gave way to starvation and the will to endure replaced the will to win. Soviet reports concealed losses, German diaries recorded collapse, and propaganda buried both. Let's uncover the 10 facts about Stalingrad that history never told in full. Myth 1. The battle was won by sheer Soviet heroism. The popular image of Stalingrad endures as a story of unwavering Soviet courage. Men and women who fought street by street until the German Sixth Army collapsed under their defiance. Textbooks and films have long portrayed it as the triumph of willpower over firepower, a moment when ordinary soldiers saved their nation through unbreakable bravery. But the archival record tells a far more complex story. This myth took root in wartime propaganda designed to sustain morale during catastrophic losses. Soviet media, under strict censorship, depicted every defense of a factory or a ruined house as an act of patriotic sacrifice. Western reporting, cut off from the Eastern Front, echoed the same theme, transforming Stalingrad into a symbol of resistance rather than a case study in strategic exhaustion. After the war, the narrative hardened. The Soviet state built entire memorials to valor while concealing the true machinery of control that held the Red Army in place. Documents from the Russian Ministry of Defense, declassified in the 1990s, reveal the extensive role of NKVD blocking detachments, special units stationed behind the front to prevent retreat. Reports from the 62nd Army indicate that hundreds of soldiers were executed or imprisoned for unauthorized withdrawal. Discipline, not merely heroism, became the backbone of Soviet endurance. Supply shortages were catastrophic. Some divisions received fewer than 10 cartridges per rifle per day during September 1942. German artillery superiority often exceeded Soviet guns 5-1 in the city's early phase. What turned the tide was not romantic bravery, but the systematic adaptation of Soviet command, urban defense zones, sniper teams, and the calculated rotation of battered units across the Volga under fire. Records show that between August and November 1942, nearly 1 million Soviet reinforcements crossed the river, sustaining the fight through sheer logistical persistence. Recognizing this truth does not diminish the courage of those who fought. It restores proportion. Stalingrad was not won by inspiration alone. It was enforced, supplied, and managed under conditions no army should endure. Behind every act of valor stood an order, an officer, and a line of supply held by desperation. From this foundation, the next truth emerges, that the battle's horror was as much a product of command decisions as of combat itself. Myth 2. The German Sixth Army was encircled by surprise. Conventional accounts suggest that Operation Uranus, the Soviet counteroffensive launched in November 1942, caught the German Sixth Army unprepared. According to this view, Paulus and his staff were blindsided by a sudden, brilliant maneuver that closed the trap around Stalingrad. The story, preserved in both Allied and Soviet post-war histories, portrays German collapse as a product of ignorance and overconfidence. The origins of this myth lie in wartime propaganda and post-war self-justification. German commanders claimed they had been misled by faulty intelligence or betrayed by Hitler's interference. Soviet accounts, in turn, celebrated the operation as a masterstroke of deception. Yet both sides simplified a far more intricate reality documented in the archives. Intelligence records from the Wehrmacht's Army Group B reveal that German officers were fully aware of Soviet buildups on both flanks weeks before the attack. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance summary from November 10, 1942, identified large Soviet armored concentrations near Serafimovich and Kletskaya, the future breakout points. The Sixth Army's own situation reports noted the weakness of its Romanian allies guarding those sectors. Yet Hitler's directive of November 1st forbade any withdrawal or strategic redeployment. Operational freedom was replaced by rigid defense orders, binding the Sixth Army to an exposed salient it could not protect. When the Soviet offensive began on November 19th, the encirclement was not unexpected. It was unstoppable. Soviet records corroborate this. Planners under Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky exploited precisely those known weaknesses, concentrating nearly 1 million troops and over 1,000 tanks against the overstretched Axis flanks. By November 23rd, Soviet spearheads linked near Kalak, sealing over 250,000 German and Allied soldiers inside the city. It was not the brilliance of concealment, but the predictability of Hitler's command structure that doomed Paulus. Historians now agree that the Sixth Army was trapped by ideology. The refusal to retreat equated with moral failure in the Führer's eyes. This correction reframes the encirclement as less of a sudden reversal and more of a preordained catastrophe. It was the culmination of months of ignored intelligence, misplaced confidence, and a command system built on obedience over survival. The next fact continues that line, revealing how the very decision to hold Stalingrad sealed the Reich's fate long before winter arrived. Myth 3. Hitler's orders alone doomed the Sixth Army. Popular narratives often isolate blame for Stalingrad's disaster on Adolf Hitler's refusal to permit withdrawal. The image of the Führer shouting commands from afar has become symbolic of irrational interference in military affairs. While his obstinacy was decisive, newly studied archives reveal a shared responsibility across the German command structure. This myth originated in the memoirs of senior officers written after the war. Men like Friedrich, Paulus, Erich von Manstein, and Albert Kesselring sought to distance themselves from defeat by framing Hitler as the sole architect of the tragedy. Western publishers amplified this account during the early Cold War, when absolving the professional Wehrmacht helped integrate West Germany into NATO. Yet German field documents and intercepted communications tell a more distributed story of failure. Army Group Dawn records show that Paulus's headquarters underestimated Soviet strength by nearly half in early November 1942. Despite repeated warnings from subordinate officers, including General Strecker of the 18th Corps, Paulus delayed evacuation plans to avoid contradicting Hitler's directive. When Manstein assumed command of Army Group Dawn, he also miscalculated the situation. Declassified reports from the OKH reveal that Manstein's rescue attempt, Operation Winter Storm, lacked both the fuel and armor reserves necessary for success. Luftwaffe logs confirm that the promised aerial supply, meant to deliver 700 tons per day, never exceeded 120. The catastrophe was not one man's madness, but a chain of obedient misjudgments enforced by loyalty and fear. Recent Russian research supports this view. Documents from the Soviet Central Archive detail how German signals traffic remained active and intelligible throughout the encirclement, indicating no systemic communication collapse. In effect, Paulus and his generals knew their predicament but chose compliance over initiative. The structure of the Wehrmacht, hierarchical, doctrinaire, and politically bound, prevented any coordinated breakout. Understanding this shifts the narrative from a morality tale about Hitler's interference to a broader study in institutional paralysis. Stalingrad became the grave of the German command ethos itself. Precision without independence, planning without adaptation. The next fact explores how the same rigid control reshaped the Soviet side, and why their victory came at a cost no army could sustain. Myth 4. Soviet command was unified and efficient. The standard image of Soviet command during Stalingrad depicts a coordinated war machine directed by Stalin, Zhukov, and Vasilevsky in perfect alignment. Western histories long admired the apparent precision of the Soviet counteroffensive, interpreting it as evidence of centralized brilliance. But contemporary research and archival declassifications have exposed a very different reality, one marked by fragmentation, rivalry, and staggering inefficiency hidden beneath triumphal reports. This portrayal originated in Soviet wartime newsreels and post-war historiography, where unity was a political necessity. Stalin's cult of leadership demanded the image of seamless control. Soviet generals, many of whom survived Stalin's purges only by obedience, reinforced that illusion. Western scholars during the Cold War lacked access to operational files, allowing the myth to endure unchallenged for decades. However, files from the Russian State Military Archive reveal intense disputes between front commanders. General Rokossovsky's Don Front often clashed with Yeremenko's Stalingrad Front over supply priorities and artillery coordination. Dispatches from November 1942 show conflicting orders issued within hours of each other, leading to repeated delays in encirclement operations. At one stage, both fronts competed for limited crossing points on the Don River, forcing Soviet engineers to rebuild bridges under German air attack. Communications were primitive. Field telephones often failed, and many operational messages were carried by motorcycle couriers through snow and artillery fire. Soviet losses in coordination were immense. Reports from the 65th and 24th Armies indicate that entire tank brigades ran out of fuel or ammunition mid-operation. Yet, because of political pressure to maintain the appearance of progress, such failures were erased from official bulletins. Stalin's own correspondence with Zhukov, preserved in the Presidential Archive, reveals his fury over delays and his threats to relieve senior officers. The victory that later appeared inevitable was, in truth, improvised daily at unsustainable human cost. This truth complicates the triumphal narrative. The Red Army prevailed not through perfect design, but through overwhelming resilience amid dysfunction. The system's rigidity and fear-driven hierarchy mirrored its enemies, though on a far greater scale. As we move to the next fact, that parallel becomes clearer, for even in victory, the Soviet machine consumed its own. Myth 5. The civilian population was safely evacuated for decades. History books implied that civilians were largely removed from Stalingrad before the full battle began. Soviet sources claimed that only a few thousand remained when the fighting reached the city center, suggesting an orderly evacuation under state supervision. Western accounts often repeated this figure, portraying the conflict as primarily military. But official documents and survivor testimonies tell a different, grimmer story. This misconception was cultivated by Soviet authorities seeking to conceal the scale of human suffering. Wartime reports emphasized successful evacuation efforts along the Volga, presenting the government as protector of its citizens. In reality, chaos reigned. Declassified NKVD and city administration files from 1942 record that fewer than half of Stalingrad's 500,000 inhabitants were evacuated before the German assault began in late August. Transportation shortages, bombed rail lines, and poor coordination left tens of thousands trapped. When Luftwaffe raids commenced on August 23rd, incendiaries transformed the city into a furnace. Eyewitness accounts collected by Soviet investigators in 1943 describe entire districts consumed, with civilians sheltering in cellars for weeks. The German advance trapped an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 non-combatants inside the ruins. Many were pressed into labor by both sides, building fortifications, carrying ammunition, or clearing rubble. NKVD reports confirm that Soviet command considered them secondary to military priorities. Food and medical supplies were reserved for soldiers. Civilian death toll estimates now exceed 40,000, though precise numbers remain impossible to verify. German diaries corroborate these figures. Entries from the 295th Infantry Division describe encountering women and children scavenging for food amid the ruins. Some civilians acted as informants or medics for the Red Army, blurring the line between combatant and victim. When the encirclement closed in November, starvation and disease consumed those who remained. Soviet medical units, entering the city after victory, found mass graves scattered along the Volga embankments. This hidden civilian dimension transforms our understanding of Stalingrad. The battle was not fought in an empty shell of a city, but among the remnants of its population. Their suffering, largely erased from post-war memory, exposes the true scale of what total war meant. As the next section will reveal, the darkness of Stalingrad was not only in its destruction, but in what both victors and vanquished chose to forget. Myth 6. The Luftwaffe's bombing was strategically effective for decades, Wartime films and official records described the Luftwaffe's August 1942 bombing of Stalingrad as a devastatingly successful opening move. According to that narrative, the German air offensive crippled Soviet defenses, annihilated infrastructure, and cleared the way for the Sixth Army's advance into the city. Contemporary reports even claimed that Stalingrad had been wiped from the map within 48 hours. The truth, however, reveals an operation that undermined Germany's own objectives from its first strike. The origins of this myth stem from wartime propaganda and the early success of air power narratives. The Luftwaffe, still recovering its prestige after the Battle of Britain, sought to demonstrate decisive capability through precision destruction. German correspondents were instructed to portray the bombing as a calculated prelude to victory. The Soviet Information Bureau, eager to counteract despair, paradoxically confirmed the scale of destruction, reinforcing the illusion of German efficiency. Yet internal memoranda from both sides paint a different picture. Operational records from Luftflotte 4 show that between August 23 and 25, 1942, German bombers dropped approximately 1,000 tons of explosives on Stalingrad. The attack destroyed much of the civilian housing, but left industrial plants like the Red October and Barricade factories largely intact. Fires created uncontrolled smoke columns that disrupted later Luftwaffe navigation, while rubble blocked the German army's approach routes. Declassified Soviet reports confirmed that several key defense strongpoints were formed amid the ruins, where tanks could no longer maneuver and infantry faced ambush at every corner. Ironically, the Luftwaffe's success in turning Stalingrad into a ruin created the perfect defensive terrain for the Red Army. Historians now agree that this bombing was tactically impressive, but strategically self-defeating. The destruction provided concealment and cover, while the psychological effect hardened Soviet resistance. Intelligence reports from the 62nd Army noted that morale among troops actually increased after the bombing, a reaction opposite to German expectations. The air raids also consumed vast amounts of aviation fuel at a time when supply lines across southern Russia were already strained. By the time Soviet counterattacks began, Luftwaffe support had diminished to a fraction of its planned capacity. The ruins of Stalingrad became Germany's own trap. Air power had achieved destruction, but not decision. What followed was not an advance through conquered streets, but a crawl through their ashes, a costly lesson in the limits of air supremacy. Myth 7. The Volga was a secure Soviet lifeline. Post-war Soviet histories often described the Volga River as an unbroken artery of supply throughout the battle, a symbol of resilience that kept the 62nd Army alive. The image of barges crossing under fire, bringing reinforcements and ammunition, became central to the mythology of endurance. But archival evidence shows that the Volga was neither secure nor consistent. For much of the battle, it functioned more as a graveyard than a lifeline. This belief grew from wartime necessity. The Soviet government needed to project the illusion of unshakable logistics to sustain morale. Film reels released in 1943 depicted orderly crossings and disciplined ferry crews. Western correspondents, relying on Soviet briefings, repeated these accounts. In truth, German artillery and air superiority turned the Volga into one of the most dangerous supply routes of the war. Declassified reports from the 62nd Army indicate that by mid-September 1942, German observers could target crossings from elevated ground on the West Bank. The Luftwaffe's Stukas and He-111s conducted near-daily raids on ferry points. A Soviet Navy dispatch dated October 12 recorded that over 60% of transport vessels were destroyed or damaged. Ammunition shortages became critical. Many infantry units received resupply only once every 4 days. Medical evacuation was almost impossible. Survivors from the river fleet described constant artillery barrages that sank boats within minutes of departure. Despite these losses, Soviet engineers improvised solutions. Night crossings using small rafts and camouflage barges allowed limited supplies to reach the city. Records from the Volga military flotilla detail the use of floating ice as cover during winter. The logistical endurance was extraordinary, but far from stable. Each successful crossing cost dozens of lives and tons of equipment. Soviet command concealed this attrition to preserve the image of invincibility. Recognizing the Volga's fragility reframes the defense of Stalingrad. The city was sustained by sacrifice, not by strength. Every crate of ammunition or ration of bread represented men who never returned across the river. It was not a steady supply line, but a bleeding artery, one that defined the character of Soviet endurance in its most brutal form. Myth 8. Stalingrad's winter was the ultimate German defeat. The traditional story presents the winter of 1942–43 as the natural force that broke the German army. Images of frostbitten soldiers, frozen weapons, and blizzards engulfing the steppe have long dominated public memory. The idea that nature, not strategy, destroyed the Sixth Army offered both sides moral comfort. Germans blamed the elements, Soviets credited the season. Yet meteorological and operational data reveal that winter was only a secondary factor. This interpretation originated in post-war memoirs of surviving German officers and Allied analyses. For a defeated army, attributing collapse to weather served as an acceptable explanation. It excused command failures while emphasizing endurance. Soviet accounts, in turn, romanticized the winter as nature's retribution. Both narratives ignored logistics. Weather reports from the German Meteorological Service record that temperatures in Stalingrad during December 1942 averaged -20 degrees Celsius, severe but not unprecedented for the region. The true collapse came from fuel starvation and supply paralysis. Luftwaffe records indicate that only 1/3 of planned resupply flights reached the encircled army after December 15th. Engine oil congealed, medical stores froze, and ammunition could not be transported. The Sixth Army's vehicles were immobilized not merely by ice, but by lack of maintenance parts and gasoline. Soviet forces, equally exposed, adapted better through organization. Archival evidence shows that the Red Army established heated field depots and distributed captured German winter clothing. The difference lay not in endurance, but in preparation. Historians such as Antony Beevor and David Glantz note that the Germans' logistical network, extending from the Don to the Volga, collapsed weeks before the temperature reached its lowest point. When Paulus's men surrendered on February 2, 1943, over 90% of fatalities had already occurred through starvation, disease, or combat, not hypothermia. Thus, winter magnified a defeat that was already certain. Nature did not destroy the Sixth Army. It merely preserved the evidence of its ruin. The myth of the punishing cold endures because it absolves human error. In truth, Stalingrad's destruction came from within, from a system incapable of sustaining itself under pressure. Myth 9. The surrender ended the battle. For most histories, February 2, 1943, marks the conclusion of the Battle of Stalingrad. The Dayfield. Marshal Paulus surrendered, and Germany's eastern campaign broke apart. The image of surrender, captured in Soviet photographs, symbolized a decisive and final end. Yet records from both sides reveal that Stalingrad did not truly end that day. For weeks afterward, the city remained a place of death, disease, and silent retribution. This misunderstanding arose from political and symbolic convenience. The Soviet government needed a clear date to mark victory, while German command sought closure to a catastrophe that defied comprehension. The Western press accepted February 2 as the official endpoint, shaping the public narrative of triumph and defeat. But internal reports tell another story. Documents from the Soviet 62nd Army show that pockets of German resistance continued until mid-February, particularly in the northern industrial sector. NKVD files record the execution of hundreds of stragglers who refused to surrender. Moreover, the aftermath brought new suffering. Soviet Medical Corps, entering the ruins, documented tens of thousands of unburied corpses. Epidemics of typhus and dysentery spread among prisoners and civilians alike. German POW records compiled by the Red Army reveal that fewer than 6,000 of the 91,000 captured would ever return home. The Soviet state concealed its own casualties. Officially, around 480,000 Soviet soldiers died during the campaign. Post-Soviet research places the number closer to 750,000. Many were buried in unmarked mass graves across the Volga plain. Reconstruction began immediately under military supervision, but Stalingrad remained largely uninhabitable until late 1944. The psychological scars persisted far longer. Understanding that the battle did not truly end with surrender reshapes its meaning. Stalingrad's conclusion was administrative, not human. For weeks after the last shots, the city existed as a necropolis, a ruin sustained by silence. The war moved westward, but Stalingrad remained its monument, preserved not by memory, but by the absence of life. Myth 10. Stalingrad defined clear victory and defeat. The enduring narrative of Stalingrad frames it as the turning point of World War II, a moment when Germany's fate was sealed and Soviet ascendancy assured. Textbooks call it the beginning of the end, a clean divide between triumph and downfall. Yet historians now recognize that the aftermath of Stalingrad was far more ambiguous. Both sides emerged broken, reshaped, and haunted by what victory and defeat truly meant. This perception arose from wartime symbolism. For the Allies, Stalingrad became proof that Hitler could be beaten. For the Soviets, it became the cornerstone of legitimacy. Western coverage hailed the battle as the greatest reversal in modern warfare. Stalin's propaganda machine ensured that Stalingrad overshadowed earlier disasters such as Kharkov and Vyazma. But documents from 1943 onward reveal that neither side experienced Stalingrad as a clean break. German military archives confirm that, despite the defeat, the Wehrmacht launched major counteroffensives within months, including Operation Citadel at Kursk. Production figures from the Reich's Armaments Ministry actually increased during the year following Stalingrad, reflecting an economy still capable of sustaining total war. The Red Army, meanwhile, suffered catastrophic losses that required months of recovery. Soviet front reports from March 1943 detail entire divisions operating at one-third strength. Stalingrad was thus not the moment of Soviet superiority, but of shared exhaustion. Historians like Jochen Helbeck and Catherine Meredale emphasize that the psychological dimension mattered more than the territorial one. Stalingrad taught both regimes the cost of ideological war, where victory demanded annihilation. Soviet soldiers carried that lesson to Berlin. German survivors carried it home as trauma. The line between victor and victim blurred in the aftermath, leaving both societies defined by loss. Stalingrad's true legacy is not triumph, but transformation. It revealed the industrial, moral, and human limits of modern warfare. The city's ruins did not mark the end of one empire and the rise of another. They marked the moment when both learned the cost of believing they could not fall. In that sense, Stalingrad remains the war's darkest truth, not because of who lost, but because of how all who fought were consumed. History rarely tells everything, but what it leaves behind still defines us. Stalingrad remains more than a battle. It is a record of endurance, command, and the fragile boundary between victory and survival. In the silence that followed, truth endured longer than the armies that fought there. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and keep history alive.